Hello, and welcome to the Step Up One-on-One training, one of two trainings focusing on elements that will help you with establishing your relationship with your one-on-ones. Today, we're going to be focusing on logistics. My name is Tyrone Parchment. I am a PhD candidate as well as field instructor for the Step Up program, and this is?
And I'm Jim Rodriguez, and I'm a research scientist here at McDover. I'm also a coordinator in Step Up, and I also do some consulting and work with the CTAC.
Yes, so today we're focusing on the logistic piece of one-on-ones. We're going to focus on all the elements that you need to know of where to go to see your one-on-ones and different elements of your one-on-ones. And also, in particular, we're going to be focusing on clinical documentation. So logistics, here are the flow of things. So Step Up is located at 7 different high schools. In Brooklyn, we have 4 high schools that are located in the Thomas Jefferson High School campus, which is located in East New York, Brooklyn. And the 4 schools are FDNY, High School for Civil Rights, Watch, as well as the Performing Arts and Technology High School. Additionally, we have 2 schools in the Bronx, Dream Yard Preparatory and Antonio Pantoja Preparatory Academy, also known as APA. And lastly, we have a location in Central Park East. So, where you could take your students from. For your one-on-ones, we see students during the course of their school day. So each of the schools, whether it be in the Thomas Jefferson High School campus or CPE, Central Park East, or the 2 schools in the Bronx, have various different times of the school day. Generally, first period starts at 7, and for most schools, they end 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning. And for other schools, they end either at 2, 3, and then there's also some schools that end at 4 or 5 o'clock. And, right, I think 4 or 5 o'clock. I believe so, yeah. So again, you could take your students out of non-core classes. So core courses are English language arts, math, history, science, those are the core courses, but you could take students out of elective courses because that could be art, gym, health, music, dance, language, if it could be a Spanish class, and also lunch. So a word of caution is that generally we try not to take students out of lunch, but depending on their schedule and if they don't have any elective courses, lunch might be a time to take your students out to meet with them for their one-on-one. But the most importantly, you need to get the teacher's approval to remove the student. So at the beginning of the period, everyone will get a bell schedule for all their designated schools that let them know what time first period through 7th period begins and ends. So during the period where students are shuttling to their next course, that's when you want to go to the classroom and ask the teacher prior to the beginning of the class if you could take out that student. Now, some schools some teachers may be okay with taking students out of the core classes, but again, you want to speak with your school lead and your supervisor just to determine the best class that you could take your student out of. But irregardless, you need the teacher's approval to remove the student, whether it be in non-core classes or elective courses.
One thing I wanted to mention with regards to lunch is oftentimes with kids, lunch can be a good time or it could be a horrible time. For some kids, sometimes kids who are anxious or kids who have, a hard time with their peers might have an easier time coming or coming to you at lunch and getting up their lunch period in the cafeteria. And then other students, of course, who are most social and connected to other kids will definitely not give up their lunchtime. So it really depends on the kid. Those are things that you can negotiate with your individual mentees.
Yes, and just to piggyback off what Jim is saying, when you first meet your students, whether it be in September and October, it could change throughout the course of your time with us, the course of the academic year, of what class that you take your students out of. But you always want to, as Jim was saying, make sure that your one-on-one is okay with you taking them out of a particular course. And this is also an opportunity to develop a relationship with the teachers as well, because part of the work with Step Up is that you're not only working with students, your one-on-ones, either in one-on-ones or in group settings, you're also developing a relationship with the school. And developing a strong relationship with the teacher is also helping you build a relationship with your student as well.
I also wanted to take a quick moment to say something that we forgot to mention at the very beginning of this presentation, and that is our goal with this is to just give you some basic understanding of these logistical issues and the documentation that you're going to be expected to do. Of course, you will have, what we suggest is that you take notes on any questions that you might have, of course, throughout, because in this format you don't have an opportunity to ask questions. But then hold those questions. We will have in-person trainings as well on more clinical skills, and you can bring those questions to those. And of course, you can bring these questions that you may have about more specific issues to your supervisors when you begin.
Yes, thank you so much, Jim, for adding that. I neglected to say that. Next up, we have where do you meet your students? So each school you may or may not have designated spaces to meet your one-on-ones with. Some schools there's designated rooms. Sometimes you could use the library, but when you first go to your school, you want to check out the school and see what other alternative spaces you may be able to meet with your student if that particular designated space for your one-on-one is occupied. And here are just some examples of other spaces where we've met with students. An empty classroom, sometimes walking down the hall with your student to just get a sense, talk with them, sometimes a teacher's lounge or the library, and sometimes even in the staircase. And again, these are extreme options, but the most important part is that you want to find a space that is comfortable for your clients, for you to engage with your client when you meet with them. Did you want to add something, Jim?
Yeah, again, for those of you, and I'll talk in a minute about the different kinds of students we have. We have students who've been in the program already. We will have new students who are recruited. Oftentimes, if you're working with a student who's been in our program for a couple of years, this is something that you can certainly ask them at the very beginning. Where have you met with your previous mentors, and what's been most comfortable to you?
Yes, and again, we are a non-traditional mental health support program, so we're very different from many inpatient or outpatient facilities where you have a designated space, a designated time, and designate a certain amount of time that you meet with your client. But with us, because we're an after-school program and we're a school-based program, we try to be as flexible as possible in meeting the needs of our young people. And again, as Jim mentioned, we have students, and we'll go in the next couple of slides, who have been with us for more than a year or two. So, and they could also let you know of spaces in the school that is safe for them to speak with you, and an opportunity for you to have your sessions with them. And speaking of sessions, here is the duration of sessions. So class time, class period are generally at 45 minutes long. So we require all of our interns to, at a minimum, meet with your one-on-ones for at least 25 minutes, and at a maximum of 45 minutes. And again, the need and the concerns or issues that is facing with your one-on-one, it can vary. Sometimes you might need to meet with them for more than 45 minutes or more than 2 periods. So again, but we just want, as a general rule of thumb, that you at least meet with them for 25 minutes at a maximum of 45. But again, given the situation that you are faced with when you're working with them, that could vary. And also, you want to meet with them at least twice a month. And depending on the relationship with your one-on-one, you can meet with them weekly, or depending on what the need of your one-on-one is. But generally, we do want all interns to meet with their one-on-one at least twice a month.
So in Step Up, we have two types of students. These are obviously very general categories. We have what we call leadership students and new students. Leadership students we would put in quotes. That doesn't necessarily mean that they have become leaders. However, what it means is that they have completed the first full year of our group life skills curriculum, or most of it. So they are kids who've been in the program for more than 1 year. In some cases, there are kids who've been in the program for 2 or 3 years. They are generally in the 10th to 12th grades, normally, and some of them may be super seniors, as we call them, kids who've been in school for even longer than that. But generally, there are kids who know the program, who've been through the program, who've been through the life skills curriculum. And in some cases, after year 1 of the program, we actually try to engage the young people in actual leadership activities, whether it be service learning activities or developing their own in-school projects. So there is some element of leadership development with kids who've been in the program already. But as I said, as a general sort of category, we refer to kids who've been in the program more than 1 year as leadership. And then we have new kids. Obviously, that's kids who are newly recruited. Just for clarification, at the schools in Brooklyn, we are pretty much closed with recruitment in Brooklyn. So those kids will typically all be leadership kids. Again, kids who've been in the program for more than 1 year. There will not be new recruitment in Brooklyn. So if you're placed at a Brooklyn school, you'll primarily be working with leadership kids. And then in the other schools in the Bronx and at CPE, those schools will have both leadership kids who've been in the program for more than 1 year, as well as an expectation to recruit new students this year. And so in addition to that, so what to expect about these students, well, we always say expect the unexpected. What we mean by that is that no matter what, when you first meet new kids, you are getting to know them. In some cases, so if they are students who are leadership students, meaning kids who've been in the program for more than 1 year, obviously they've been seen by previous interns. There are case notes and biopsychosocial assessments on them. So you will have some information going into your relationships with the leadership students. But of course, for new students, there will be no information other than what we get from our nomination forms that we get from the schools. So new kids are nominated to our program. When kids are nominated, we get some basic information about them in terms of their need or appropriateness for Step Up, but you won't have a lot of new information. But again, whether they're leadership kids or new students, getting to know them, especially returning from summer where all kinds of things could have happened, there will always be new things to learn. And then also in terms of leadership students, moving into leadership students, when you meet with leadership students, because they've been in the program for more than 1 year, obviously an important place to start is to discuss their previous experience with Step Up, their previous relationship with their one-on-ones, their previous group experiences, so getting some idea of where they've been. And then in terms of developing your relationship with your individual mentees, certainly having a discussion about how they worked with their previous mentor, what they did, what worked, what didn't work, and also how things ended. That's a critical piece. So one of the things that you'll have to be prepared for with leadership students is that oftentimes they develop a pretty close relationship with their mentors, and terminating becomes very difficult. Many of our students often complain about the fact that, especially again students who've been with us more than 1 year, complain about the fact that they have to switch interns. Those are the kinds of issues that you'll have to work through in your relationships. And when we have a more in-depth training on clinical interventions and sort of clinical skills, we'll talk more in depth about how to handle that. For the time being, though, we just want to focus on what the expectations are and some of these logistical issues. So again, we could have more conversations about how to process that with young people in future trainings when you come on board. With regards to new students, One of the things, of course, that you're going to want to do is give them a good overview of Step Up and talk about the purpose and goals of Step Up. You will want to review with them feelings about being nominated to the program. And again, just a quick side note on our terminology. We use the term nominated instead of referrals because we try as much as possible to be non-stigmatizing. And so we feel that when kids think about it as being nominated, not referred for mental health services, there's a different feel to it. And kids are more open to attending and seeing us. So, so you might want to talk to them about their feelings about being nominated, explain to them what it means to be nominated. What I often say very simply to young people is nominated means somebody, a teacher or a guidance counselor, felt that you could use some support in moving ahead in school and progressing in school, and that's why you're in Step Up. I usually try to keep it that simple, but again, in future trainings we can talk a little bit more about how to process that. And then you want to discuss your role, and then as we talked about before, meeting times, classes, class schedules, places to meet, and then as well goals and personal experiences and feelings about being in the program. And then most importantly, confidentiality. Again, we're going to be talking a lot more about this when we have our face-to-face training, but talking about confidentiality early on, as early as possible, is critical to the process of building a working relationship with your mentees. So some one-on-one do's. Very clearly, be consistent. Consistency means, of course, things like following up. If you say you're going to be there at a particular period to pick them up, you're there at a particular period to pick them up. Oftentimes, what we see with young people in our program is that they might skip a class. You might arrange with them to meet at a particular period, and they're not there. For us, what's important is that you follow up on what you've said. So being consistent means that. Being consistent also means being, as I said, sort of on time and where you're supposed to meet. We provide support, and that can mean emotional support, obviously demonstrating empathy for young people. We try to be non-confrontational, non-judgmental in our approach, even though we expect or hope to work on kids with regards to their academic performance in school and helping them get to graduation. That's our primary goal. We do that by being supportive with them, understanding what many of the challenges and obstacles that they might have to achieving school outcomes are, and being supportive. That also means reframing setbacks and failures. So again, we try to be positive. We'll talk a little bit more about our positive youth development approach. But in many ways, we try not to harp on failures or setbacks that kids have had, and think more about solutions to problems that they might be facing. And then collaborative. We try to send the message of working together with the young people, and we use the word "we" quite a bit when we're working with our young people. What can we do to help you move forward? What can we do to solve a particular problem? So there are a lot of different ways in which you can communicate to young people the collaborative nature of your work, and as I said, we'll talk a lot more about that in clinical training.
And just to piggyback on collaborate is very essential to the work that we do, and it really reduces the risk of the savior complex that sometimes is very endemic in the work that social workers do. That we really see that the work that we do with our one-on-one, the work that we do with our teams, is in working with them. We're not working for, we're working with, we're working together, because they are capable of being able to handle their problem. They just need that assistance. I feel like that we are probably sometimes maybe the backseat driver. Like they are in charge of their car, they're in charge of where they could go, and we're in the back kind of well, maybe you could go the left this time, or maybe you could stop and ask directions. But again, this is in collaboration, and we're really not there to save our young people, because they are capable of living their own lives before and after us, but we're just here in the moment in their lives of just really to support them and collaborate in helping them where they see that they need to go.
and I think Tyrone kind of covered the don'ts in some ways as well, which is fine. So yeah, we have to, and again, as I said, we'll work through this in your clinical training, and of course in individual supervision. But yeah, some of the don'ts that we strongly sort of promote and recommend is not trying to fix the problem, not trying to necessarily change kids through confrontation and judgment, but of course we do want to help kids progress. But it's critical that you don't see yourself as the fixer, the savior, and it's both for your own mental health and the effectiveness of your work. It's also important not to overshare or overrelate. Sometimes in trying to work with young people, we do things that are not necessary. We try to adopt the language of young people. We try to dress differently, or we try to also share overly about ourselves. These are things that are that we discourage. However, in many ways, we will talk about in clinical training more effective ways of connecting with and joining with your clients that can help you move forward in your relationship with them and in setting goals. And then going back to the other thing that Tyrone was also addressing, avoid working in isolation. So as he spoke about, you'll have a supervisor, a field instructor, you'll be working as part of a team at your school. These are all different ways in which you can collaborate and work with others in supporting you as clinicians and practitioners in your work with young people. It can be extremely sometimes daunting and difficult and challenging to work with young people. So we strongly encourage you to share your challenges and difficulties in supervision and in group team meetings. So moving into some of our documentation. So we will expect you to have follow-up notes written up on every contact or session that you have, excuse me, not every contact, because you may have contacts that don't necessarily need a follow-up note, but for every session or every meeting that you have with your mentees, you will be expected to complete a follow-up note. A follow-up note is your a summary of your interaction with your client that includes a mental status exam and your clinical impressions of what occurred. We do this for two reasons. One is for our own documentation, but also even though we're a non-traditional alternative mental health program, we feel that this is important for your education as you prepare to move into more traditional clinical settings. And these are the kinds of things that would be expected if you were in a more traditional mental health setting, a clinic or a hospital. Okay, so the follow-up note. In the follow-up note, we'll ask for basic information about your contact, obviously the student, the grade, and the length of the contact. So these are check-offs that you have in there. And then we ask you to do, again, a mental status exam. A mental status exam is simply a quick snapshot of the child's mental status in the moment, at the time of your contact with the student. Doesn't have to do with your impressions about what's going to happen later or their lives outside. It's simply a snapshot of how they come into the session and how they present in the session with you. So very quickly, I'll go through this very quickly, but mood is the student's reported mood when they arrive. A simple way of addressing this or asking students about their mood is simply asking students how you're feeling today. Oftentimes, students will tell you verbally how they're feeling, whether they're feeling happy or depressed or irritable or angry. So what they report is how you indicate mood. Normal, again, what that also addresses is not necessarily normal in the sense that they're happy. It just may mean normal for that individual student. So if a student just generally presents as somewhat less optimistic or less connected, that is normal for them. So in many ways, normal is going to be student specific. And if you see changes over the course of your connection, of your contacts with them, where they come in more optimistic than they have at previous sessions, or more depressed, or more irritable, you can indicate that as well. And then under that you have severity. So again, that typically refers only to sort of non-normal or out of the norm behavior or presentation on the part of the student. So again, if they come in, and I should say also for the kind of negative presentation. So if they come in looking depressed or irritable or angry, you also have an opportunity to indicate to what severity they come in feeling that way. Affect refers to your observation of the student's affect during the course of the session. Full range simply refers to their ability to express and or demonstrate a variety of emotions during the session, and those emotions are somewhat consistent with what they're talking about, the topic that they're talking about, or with their mood. It could be blunted or flat, meaning they're saying it with very little affect, or they're talking with very little affect. Blunted is usually a little bit more severe than flat. So flat might be sort of a monotone, very sort of depressed kind of presentation, and blunted would be even more severe than that. Constricted simply means they only talk about a constricted range of emotions, so there might be some variability, but not a lot. Labile actually means the opposite. There's a lot of variability in their presentation. They might talk very sort of in a very manic way 1 minute, and then in a very depressed way, so they kind of tend to go up and down during the course of the session. And then inconsistent with mood. So if a young person is talking to you about something horrible and they do it with a smile, or they do it with a strange kind of affect that doesn't sort of fit what they're talking about or what they're presenting, then you would indicate inconsistent. Rapport simply has to do with, again, in that session, the rapport that you have with the student, easy to establish. They come in, they're open, they're talking, they're generally engaged with you. And then you have other possibilities, difficult at the beginning, and this is oftentimes very typical. Oftentimes kids will come in and initially they'll be a little slow to warm, but eventually you'll get them talking and they'll become more engaged over time. And then difficult to establish is, it could just be a kid who comes in and just doesn't want to talk, is for whatever reason, and that may be consistent with their mood and affect. They're just not engaged with you. And then tenuous, it just may be they're a little bit reticent, reluctant to share with you. And then easily upset. Could just be them responding to the topics of the conversation and blowing up for what might be perceived as minor things. Speech can be age appropriate. That's typically what you'll see presented, but it could be, you know, the speech could be logical, understandable, delayed, poor articulation, illogical, flat, and pressured. In many ways, the bottom line with all these other possibilities, well, age appropriate and logical is what you might indicate is if you're having a typical conversation with your student. And understandable as well. So if a student comes in and you have a normal conversation with them, you might indicate age-appropriate, logical, and understandable for most sessions. However, if you're seeing changes in their speech patterns, you could indicate delayed, again, meaning that they're slow to respond, poor articulation, which is pretty clear. It's not very clear what they're saying. Illogical, meaning they go from one topic to another. Flat or pressured. Pressured is something that you might see in young people, for example, who might be using substances or might be high in the session. So these are all indicators that there might be something wrong with them in that contact that you're having with them. So that's their speech. Their thought processes, again, could also be logical. It doesn't necessarily, logical does not necessarily mean rational. It just means that the topics make sense, that they go from one topic to another and they're sort of connected in a way that makes sense. It might not necessarily be the way you might do things, but they're talking about things that are logically connected to each other. Obsessive just means they're fixated on a particular topic. Delusions can be beliefs that are untrue or kind of bizarre beliefs that the student is expressing to you. Beliefs can be sort of paranoid beliefs or beliefs about their relationship with other students that might be a little bit bizarre. And then hallucinations can be auditory or visual. And if there's any signs of auditory and or visual hallucinations, again, that simply means seeing things or hearing things that other people can't see. And again, when we have face-to-face clinical training time, we can get into more detail about how to assess for that. With judgment, one way to get at judgment, a formal way of getting at judgment, is to ask a very simple question about a problem that they might be or a situation they might encounter and getting their thoughts on it. Something like if you're walking down the hall and you find an envelope that doesn't, that's lying on the ground, what would you do with it? It's very simple questions. That's a formal way of doing it. We don't necessarily recommend doing it in a formal manner. Oftentimes in the natural conversation you're having with kids, you might get some ideas about their judgment and the degree to which that judgment may or may not be impaired. So for example, if you have a student talking about skipping a class and they share with you that they're skipping that class for a specific reason, that might be a mild, or I should say for some innocuous reason. They're skipping that class because they didn't get their homework done and they were afraid the teacher was going to call on them. That might be sort of fairly innocuous and understandable, but if they're skipping that class, for example, to use drugs, or if they're skipping that to hang out with friends and use drugs, or if they're skipping that class to engage in some other kind of acting out behavior, that gives you a better sense of the degree to which that judgment is more significantly impaired. So there's a lot of ways to address judgment. That's the one area where when you're talking about judgment, you might be talking about their behavior outside of the session. Appearance can be appropriate, inappropriately dressed, or unkempt. Unkempt usually means unhygienic. They might have an odor, or they might have dirty clothing on. Inappropriately dressed, again, working in a school, that typically might mean not dressing according to the dress code of the school, and oftentimes, again, that's sort of culturally specific. But appropriately dressed is the kind of default. And then you have risk factors for suicide and homicide. Typically, students will not report these things. However, it does happen where students might report some suicidal ideation. It's important to distinguish between ideation, plan, and means. Very simply, ideation is just the thought of wanting to hurt themselves or kill themselves. A plan means specific ideas about how they might do that, and means addresses the availability of those plans. So, for example, if a student says that they would kill themselves by taking pills, and they have pills at home in the mother's or in the family's medicine cabinet, that obviously raises the risk factor. And similarly with homicidal potential, homicide potential. Again, obviously, anytime those concerns are raised, those are immediate causes for you to talk to your supervisor about that and report it back to your supervisor. We'll talk more in depth about that in clinical training. And then the last thing is impulse control. Again, that has to do with their impulse control in the sessions. Are they able to sit and follow the discussion and maintain a discussion with you without being fidgety or jumping all over the place or walking around the room or those kinds of things. So if they're able to have a fairly contained discussion with you without getting up or moving around, that gives you a sense of impulse control. So that's the mental status exam. And then your write-up would be on the second page. And the write-up of your session, and we'll show an example in a little while, but your write-up of the session will include a very brief summary of your mental status exam and your clinical impressions of the session, what you think was going on in the session, and then a plan for what you're going to do next, whether it is you opened up a topic during that session and you're going to follow up at the next session, or if you actually came up with some specific steps that a student might take to solve a particular problem you discussed in session, the plan would be that. Your specific plans for following up with that. Now, as far as the format of your summary, I'm going to turn it over to Tyrone to talk a little bit about our SOAP format.
Great, thanks, Tim. So the SOAP format is commonly used in many clinical settings. And SOAP stands for subjective, objective, assessment, and plan. So the S, the subjective, is really just what the client tells you. This is a view that does not leave room for interpretation. You ask the client how they're doing, and they tell you how they are. That's a subjective piece of where you write how the client reports how they feel. The objective is the factual. It's what you're observing and what you witness. And that's more specifically focusing on the appearance, the affect, and the behavior of your client. And as Jim went over the mental statics exam, you have the subjective and objective information from that mental statics exam. Jim, you have anything else to add to that?
No, except that, again, the objective is that integration of what the client tells you and what they present. So, for example, if a student, I gave the example earlier of a student talking to you about something horrific that happened to them, but they're saying it with a smile, or they're laughing as they say it, and they're sort of inconsistent. Those are some of your observations. So that would be your factual observation. The student said this, but they looked this way, factual.
And comparing the subjective and objective, as Jim mentioned, is focus on the assessment, which is the A. That's your summary of your clinical thinking. And it's a combination of what the client said and what you're observing, and you're making an impression of the two. Is the client saying that they're very happy, but then yet they're discussing issues that are very sad? So there's a disconnect between what they're saying and their affect, and you're going to write an assessment of that.
Well, and that will also include your assessment of that, but will also include your processing of that. So that, for example, if you point that out to the student and they're able to explain, that would go into your note as well. So how you process that with the student will also be reflected in it will partially be reflected in your clinical assessment.
And last but not least, you have a plan. So whatever transcribed within that session, you have a plan of what's going to happen moving forward. Is it continue having this discussion next time you meet with the client? Is it assessing getting additional services? Is it focusing on a game plan of how to help the client move forward with whatever brought up that came up within that section? So the plan piece has to be action-oriented, and you have to discuss the next step of what's going to happen next with the client. So you're going to continue having discussion next week when you meet with the client during their 4th period class. Or we'll seek out additional services to help the client out with this particular issue that happened in this session. Again, it's all specific and action-oriented, and it's the plan arises from what transcribed during that interaction with your client. And again, here's some helpful hints of how to, so the SOAP format, the subjective, objective, assessment, and plan, is a guiding force of how can you write up the focus of that session with the client. But also, as we're a positive youth development framework of the work that we do, we want to avoid using hostility in the language that we are writing about with our clients. I remember when I was in school, a good rule of thumb is that any case note or follow-up note that we write of our clients, we have to write it as if they are right behind us looking over our shoulder. So we don't want to write anything, any words or use any language that's very, that's heightened with any negative connotation with it. Now in the mental status exam, as Jim went over, you could also argue that some of the language can be seen as a little pathological. But how you write up that session is in a way that doesn't make it appear or has a connotation that our client or any way is presented in a pathological way. You're just really just describing what you're seeing, and these are the language that we're using, but the write-up isn't in any way shouldn't focus on anything on the negative aspect of who we are totally. It's very tricky, and again, we're going to process this a lot more when we are in part 2 of our one-on-one training, because again, it gets very tricky. Did you have anything to add, Jim?
Yeah, well, and I think Tyrone is, I think to underscore when we talk about these helpful hints here, to underscore what I think Tyrone is also addressing here is the notion of avoiding your interpretation. As much as possible, if you focus on what the client said, how they responded to your questions and your processing of it, without your judgments or interpretations, that's the part that you want to try to leave out. So if a client talks about having a fight with another student, your description of that, both of how they talk about that fight and that interaction and your processing of that with them is included in the notes. Your interpretations or your judgments about what that means for them as an individual, what that means about their character, what that means about them as a human being should not be part of the note. Okay, those are the kinds of things that you want to try to avoid.
Thank you, Jim. And then you want to be this very clear and precise of your observations, and if at any point use quotation from directly of what your one-on-one is discussing. And as Jim mentioned, you want to really avoid including your interpretation. And this comes with practice. And definitely in our second portion of our one-on-one training, we will discuss ways of how to be objective in our assessment of our clients, but also over time during supervision and during constant instances of writing this, you'll be able to identify how much of this is your interpretation and how much is it that really transcribed in this session, and which is why supervision is very, very important.
So the biopsychosocial assessments are part of the documentation as well. And the biopsychosocial assessment is a comprehensive snapshot picture of the student. It can serve some very important functions with regards to identifying available resources that the student has, as well as identifying the needs and the supports that the students may have as well. If it's an initial biopsychosocial, it can be completed. So going back to what we talked about earlier, we have leadership students and new students. Leadership students will have had a biopsychosocial already completed. New students will need a biopsychosocial completed. If it is an initial biopsychosocial, one of the things that we say is that it can be completed formally, meaning you could have our biopsychosocial form with you, and you can go through it with the young person, asking them various questions. But it can also be completed sort of on an ad hoc basis, meaning that you will have to, that you can sort of glean the information from conversations you have with the young person or information that you obtain, just naturally engaging and building rapport with the young person, and then fill in the gaps when you get closer to the deadline, and we'll talk about deadlines in a minute, but when you get closer to the deadline for completing and having the biopsychosocial completed for the files. In the case of leadership students who already have a biopsychosocial, one of the things that's important is obviously to review those biopsychosocials to get better understand and get a sense of your students before you meet with them. And they should and can be updated based on new information that you obtain. Very quickly, you can see here what goes into the biopsychosocial form is you can include client goals, an assessment of their family life, educational experiences, physical issues or biological issues that they might have, psychological issues, and social issues. So as we move into the details of it, these are some of the questions that you were asked. In some cases, you're asked to obtain just factual information. The middle school they attended, do they have an IEP? Do they, and in some cases, students may have this information. In some cases, they don't. So part of your biopsychosocial may involve getting information on the students from other, like teachers or guidance counselors. So again, some students actually might not even realize that they have an IEP. They might be in special ed and not even know it, sadly enough. But that can occur. So your biopsychosocial not only involves information you get from the student directly, but it could also involve information you obtain from other resources, from other sources.
But it includes, IEP is an individual education plan, so that's for folks who do not know. That's for students who need additional assistance, whether it be developmentally, cognitively, socially, or academically, to help them along with their high school career. And again, as Jim mentioned, some don't even know that they have an IEP, but it's an individualized educational plan for folks who, for individuals with developmental disabilities or cognitive disabilities, social, or any academic difficulties as well.
Yes. And so and again, with some of these, you see that we have items that we want you and information that we want you to get, but also the format in which you get it. So oftentimes, simply starting off by asking the young person a very sort of broad question. Tell me about school. How is school going for you? Can be the beginning of a conversation about school that can give you some of this factual information. And again, we will talk a little bit more about specific ways in which you can more naturally and sort of not in a formal way sort of obtaining this information. The next slide. And so in addition to the factual information, we also ask questions about their perceptions about these areas of their lives. So their perceptions about why they've been referred to Step Up, their relationships with teachers. So these are more qualitative questions about relationships at school and difficulties that they might be having. And one of the things I want to highlight, too, is that there's questions in here that we suggest or areas that we also want to assess for, things like bullying and school violence. So the general feelings of safety while they're in school become important issues to document in the biopsychosocial. Similarly with families, with family information, again, simply starting off this area by asking young people about their family. Tell me about your family. Talk to me a little bit about your family. We similarly have factual information about who they live with and where they live, and as well as the quality of the relationships with family members, interpersonal relationships, the activities that they engage in. So you can see that we're really trying to get a very sort of broad picture of the student's life and getting to know all aspects of the student's life with regards to their recreational activities and peer relationships. The interpersonal relationships section is very critical. Of course, working with adolescents, peers become an incredibly important and significant part of their lives. So asking questions about their peer relationships and interpersonal relationships is important. Moving into the next area, mental health history. One of the things that we will I often suggest is when you get into information that might be, of course, very personal and also very stigmatizing, I always recommend asking permission or prepping the student before you ask a question like about their mental health history. So for example, saying, I'm going to ask you something that might feel a little bit awkward, but I need to ask you it, or prepping them in that way, or simply asking, can I ask you a question about mental health? Just to prep them and to also demonstrate your empathy and your understanding that sometimes these issues are not easy to talk about. So that's a way of getting at this information. But again, it's also part of the assessment, is trying to get a good understanding of what their mental health history is. And again, oftentimes, if you do it in a compassionate and a soft way, you will get the information that you're looking for. So those are some of the things that we ask you to include. Oh, sorry, one other section. So the last section has to do with safety and risk. Again, what I said earlier becomes really important with regards to questions about safety and risk. So asking permission and prepping them to ask them questions about safety and risk are important. And then we do ask questions or try to obtain information about their sexual activity, whether they're sexually active or not, history of suicide, and other self-injurious behavior, drug use, substance use, and child abuse or neglect. So these are all kinds of behaviors that, again, we want to try to assess for. And then we end with your clinical impressions of the student overall. That is your overall impression of the student based on the information that you've gathered, as well as your goals and intervention plan moving forward. And then, of course, this has to be signed off on by your supervisor, field instructor. What's really important, and this is both for the case, the follow-up notes, and the biopsychosocials, really important vocabulary, and this goes back to the point that we were making earlier about reporting factual information, and being as factual as you can in your documentation. This is just helpful vocabulary. The student reported, the student described, the student expressed X, Y, or Z emotion, believed, revealed. So these are just all different kinds of ways in which you can be clear about how you're characterizing the communication that you're having with the student, and how you sort of maintain that factual kind of objective nature of the interactions and the information you're obtaining.
And to piggyback on what Jim was saying, now that you have access to the full biopsychosocial and all the questions that are needed to ask to obtain information for the student, it is very important to not go into that one-on-one and have it read as an interview. You want it to really make it to be a conversation. Again, these are teenagers. You want it to be as engaging as possible. And so it's helpful prior to meeting with your one-on-one and prior to even going to the school is get a real grasp of what the biopsychosocial assessment is and what are the questions that are asked. So you could think of ways of how best can I ask these questions, whether it be just the very basic to the more personal questions. How can I ask these questions that are in a way that can be very engaging? Because, again, you have 45 minutes at most with some of our young people, and you want to make it as engaging as possible. So really taking the time to really review the document and get a sense of how can I ask these questions? What ways can I bring it up in a way that's more conversational and less interviewing, to also just make the client feel a lot more comfort and welcomed.
So we're going to end. So we're going to end with a little bit of a couple of examples of a follow-up note, completed follow-up notes, and biopsychosocials. So this is a follow-up note, and one thing I want to just thank you. Okay. So one of the things that I wanted to sort of clarify is that when you do the when you do the follow-up note, basically all of the first checks in there are excuse the term, are what we would expect in a normal interaction with your student. As I said, normal in quotes, meaning sort of normal for that student. So typically if a student comes in and they're fairly consistent in their presentation, really the first checkoff will be either the first or the second box in each of those sections. So normal and optimistic might be in their full range. Again, that would be a normal presentation, easy to establish rapport, age-appropriate speech, logical and understandable. So these are all things where you have your kind of default checkoffs, logical, appropriate to situation in terms of judgment, appropriate appearance, so on and so forth. So everything is set up so that the first 2 or 3 boxes, first 1, 2, or 3 boxes that you would check off in each section are what you might normally expect from a student. And that's typically what we get. The reason for that also is because then you have space to document if you see anything that is out of the norm for that student. They come in particularly depressed or irritable, so and so on and so forth. So in this particular case, you have a student who comes in this particular session. I could tell just from the mental status exam that she may have come in specifically or particularly optimistic that day, obviously consistent with mood. So this looks like a very normal interaction that a student may have
a mentor may have with their student, and then you look down at the bottom and you see impulse control medium, so that's a little bit out of the norm. Again, impulse control, if it's the norm, actually this is a little bit off, it should be high. So high impulse control meaning that the student is very well under control. So if they put in medium, I would want to see something in the note about why they might have been a little bit out of the norm. And similarly at the very top, sort of an explanation of what that optimism is about as well. And then you see just a brief note about just the general interaction. Jane's interpersonal style was friendly and engaging. So again, that tells me that this was a pretty positive session. And then you go into the specifics. So this is again beginning with a sort of recapitulation of the session in many ways, but we've kind of tried to break it down by identifying the SOAP in this note. So it begins with intern met with the student for approximately 45 minutes in the library. Subjective, Jane described having a good week in school. Okay, she began the session stating that she is very proud of herself for getting in all her assignments in on time. So that is the subjective. That is Jane's report of how she's doing, how she's coming into the session. And she also reported that one of her teachers told her that if she kept up the good work, she can be a student of the month. So again, you can see all the reasons, not only what she is saying, but all the reasons why this mentor, this clinician would look at that as being optimistic. The objective, so this is again, going back to our SOAP, the objective being the writer's impression. Jane's mood was optimistic and consistent with her affect. Her speech, thought process, and judgment were logical, appropriate. So again, this is just a reiteration of the mental status exam. And then no suicidal, homicidal ideation. The assessment, she appears to be doing well with her homework. She continues to discuss ways in which she can improve her grades, but is able to acknowledge her accomplishments. Jane mentioned that she will communicate the good news of her schoolwork to her parents. So this is all, again, in many ways, the writer's impressions of or outline of what was discussed in the session. And then she ends it with some general plans and a more specific plan underneath. The intern is scheduled to meet with Jane on Tuesday during her health class for a one-on-one meeting, so it's just a simple sort of, the plan is to meet again and continue to provide support as needed. And so this is a very clear note. Again, also it's important to understand that the follow-up notes are not intended to be very extensive. They're not a process recording. One of the things I would say about this note, even though we use this as an example, is I think for me, what might be missing, I would ask about is why did the person indicate a medium impulse control, because I'm not seeing any problems with impulse control in this, so I might ask about that. But again, a very simple, straightforward description of what happened in this session. And then for the biopsychosocial, you see here an example of a student who has provided a complete biopsychosocial assessment. And you see the various examples. So it includes information about their IEP. I think Tyrone went into some detail about that earlier, about what an IEP is. And in this particular case, the student appears to have knowledge about their IEP and is very aware of what's in the IEP, which, to be honest with you, would be a little unusual. Now, what's not clear to me in this also, but would have to be fleshed out, is whether that information was obtained from the student themselves or from the school. So I should actually just check myself and say that that information could have been obtained either from the student directly or from the school. But the information is in there, and it includes what special education services the student is receiving, and then information about repeating grades. Oh, okay. Oh, okay, sorry. So I think Tyrone was just telling me that this information was obtained from the guidance counselor. There's also information about the grade point average. Again, that could be obtained from the guidance counselor. One of the things that we do collect on students at the end of every year, or actually periodically throughout the year, is their transcripts and their report cards. So this information, again, might also be obtained from their case record and the school, the guidance counselor, and other sources. And then you also see some information about that the student provides about their relationship with the teachers and what they state. So, we apologize because part of this is cut off, but in the relationship with the teacher, this gets along with the teachers, but states that he's disrespectful when his teachers are disrespectful to him. So you have some sense of how the student responds in certain situations, and you're providing some important information about the student's interaction with the teachers. In here, you see information, again, very good descriptions of and answers to all of these questions. I don't want to go into, we won't go into detail about every one of these, but one of the things that we do want to highlight is the importance of narratives with regards to answering these questions. So these should not be one-word answers to these questions. So very simply, we need your narrative, we need sentences, complete sentences and questions. We apologize if that sounds a little basic, but sometimes some biopsychosocials come back with just one or two-word answers. That's not sufficient. It should be a very clear narrative in response to these questions in terms of what you've the information you've obtained in answering these questions. And as Tyrone mentioned, this is also why, as we discussed earlier, it's important to have this information kind of in your mind as you're going along and working with students, because some of the answers to these questions might, again, come even before you formally move to complete the biopsychosocial assessment. It may be information that you've gotten from previous sessions or just initial sessions with them, getting to know them, building rapport. So the other thing that we recommend is that you should not only sort of keep this in mind when you're going to maybe formally complete it, but also complete it as you go along. So for example, if in your initial meeting with your student, you have a very significant and important discussion about their relationship with their teachers or their relationships with other students or their academic strengths, that you go to the biopsychosocial and put it in there and begin to fill in those sections as you go along, again, through the natural course of your conversations with them with as much detail as possible. And then you have a little summary here about the students' main concerns about schools at this time, that they're worried about graduating on time, and they have spent time discussing small steps that they can take in reaching these goals, possibly with previous mentors. So you have a good description of their concerns about their times, what they've tried to do previously to improve their academic performance. And then as I said, as you go along, you have very specific information about their family composition. I'm sorry, to begin, what things they've done to address those concerns. There's very specific and clear information about what they've tried already. And then you go into family composition. Again, we won't go into complete detail on every response. The important thing is as much detail as you can provide as possible, and also to reiterate something we've said before, using quotes and other information that's factual that the students report. One of the things that we, again, recommend, and I've kind of stated this previously, but when you first get assigned your your mentee, your student, again, we suggest that you take a good, thorough look at their biopsychosocial to get some idea of what's already been obtained and what information you already have on them. And then again, we can talk a little bit about how to process that information with them when you begin your work. So, and then here we go with the clinical impressions. You could see a summary of their strengths. The student is very resilient for all that he has already been through in his life. I think that's really important to address. Many of the students that you work with will have gone through some very difficult challenges in their lives. Some assessment of their ability to handle those challenges is really critical. So you have some assessment of their strengths, their determination, their motivation, and their relationships with others. So you see a number of different strengths that are one of the things, of course, that we talk about in social work is strength-based assessment. So it's critically important for you to identify as many strengths as possible. Their ego functioning. In this particular case, the student is able to express themselves very clearly, is able to express their thoughts and feelings in a coherent way. There's some assessment here about their level of self-esteem, which is obviously a very important component of ego functioning. Their ability to assess themselves, that goes into their ego functioning, their flexibility, their sort of cognitive flexibility, and their understanding of problems and how they're seen by others, as well as how they react to others. So these all go into ego functioning, and then an assessment of their coping skills. And here you could see there's a little bit of a kind of hedge on the part of the person. We haven't spent a lot of time discussing coping skills, but this student deals with a lot of stress each day. So again, there's a little hedge there by the writer of the biopsychosocial indicating that more information, that even though they haven't spoken about this, more information might be needed. But that they are engaged in certain activities to help cope with stress, and some basic information on their coping skills. And then an assessment of their openness to Step Up and working with Step Up and the Step Up mentor. And then you see here a very basic plan. It doesn't have to be an extensive behavioral plan. Oftentimes, though, it's important to review this as well at the beginning of your work with students to get some sense of what's been worked on in the previous year. And also, be keeping in mind that this assessment may have been done early in the process, so that's also why you'll have to read up on the follow-up notes that hopefully will answer some questions about the degree to which this plan was actually completed in the previous year and what was able to be followed through on. So that's a biopsychosocial assessment, and we're going to end with a little bit of where you put all this information.
Yes, thank you, Jim. So we store our clinical documents both electronically and also in hard copies. For leadership students, their follow-up notes and biopsychosocial assessments either are just in hard copy form or in hard copy and electronic copy. So, and again, we'll discuss more of this at the second training for one-on-ones. But our electronic storage is through NYU Box. So all NYU students as well as Hunter students who are interns with us here at Step Up will have access, we'll have an NYU email, username, and ID, and we'll have access to NYU Box, which functions very similar to like a Dropbox as well as Google Drive. But with NYU Box, it's secure and it's also confidential and meets the HIPAA and FERPA regulations. The hard copy files are stored in the file cabinet, which again will show you where that is during the second phase of our one-on-one training. And then within each student's file folder is filed under their school name. So whether it be Watch, Path, CPE, APA, or DreamYard Prep, they have their own individual files, and the student names are filed alphabetically in those folders. And on the NYU Box, when you log in with your username and password, you'll see the Step Up project. You click onto that, and what will open up will be the school that you're designated to. So each student will have access to their specific schools, and you click on the school, and you will see two folders for biopsychosocial assessment as well as case notes, which is what we also call as follow-up notes. And you store those files there electronically, and once you obtain the signature on your follow-up notes and for the psychosocial assessment, you can file those hard copies in the file cabinet. So here are just arrows just to pinpoint what I was just saying. And deadlines. The importance of deadline is that you acquire the information that you need for the psychosocial assessments in a timely fashion. So as we mentioned earlier when we started this webinar, is that you at a minimum meet with your client, with your mentee client. Again, we use language interchangeably here, at least twice a month. So if you started seeing clients in, let's say, October, by the third or fourth session, which would be around middle of November, and here on the screen it's 2015, but the essence of it, in the middle of November, you should have the bulk of the information needed to complete the biopsychosocial assessment. So, for instance, if you start seeing your clients in November, by middle November, if you start seeing your clients in October, beginning of October, by middle November, that should be the third or fourth one-on-one session, and by then you should have all the information collected. So from there, you have at least 2 weeks to complete the written biopsychosocial assessment. So for instance, if it's by November 11th, if you meet with your client on Wednesdays, but that should be the fourth visit, which you should have completed obtained the information for it. And by the 25th, before Thanksgiving, you should have it sent to your supervisor for review, consultation, and to be signed. So you have up to the third or fourth session to get all the information, and then you have 2 weeks to complete it. And the reason why we want to have all these deadlines is your students, some of you, this is your first year with us, this is your second or your advanced standing, and you have a lot of mitigating responsibilities, whether it be for school, personal, professional, what have you. So we want to make sure that you are just following these deadlines so that by the end of the year, you're not scrambling around completing psychosocial assessments. And if at any point by the third or fourth time that you meet with your client that you're unable to acquire all the information, make sure you let your field instructor, field supervisor know that you're having difficulty in getting all the information and submitting it on time. Let your supervisor know prior to the third or fourth session so that you can have a plan and a new deadline to complete the necessary paperwork. And again, you'll have your field instructor sign off on both the biopsychosocial assessment as well as the case notes, as well as the follow-up / case notes. So this ends our first one-on-one training, more focused on logistics. And again, as Jim mentioned, please have any questions that you might have for us, we'll be happy to answer them when we have our second phase of our one-on-one training, which is solely focusing on the clinical aspect of it. And so we thank you very much for joining with us, and we look forward for seeing you in the second one-on-one training in September. Take care.
Thank you.